I want to thank everybody for coming tonight. You're in for a treat. Thank you for venturing out in the rainy weather. Before I introduce our speaker tonight, I would just like to say that tonight is the last night that we're going to have the programs in here. From now on, they're going to be out in the lobby. So when you come for the next program, the next one won't be here because of History Conference. But starting in October, they will be out in the lobby, and we'll have it all set up and ready for you to go. And after Christy does talk tonight, we'll have a question and answer thing. And if you could wait till I come around with the hand mic, because this is being taped, and that way the folks at home that are watching it at home will be able to hear your question, okay? Okay, Christy Leskovar was born in Butte, Montana, and grew up in Kennewick, Washington. I grew up in Yakima. She graduated from Seattle University with degrees in mechanical engineering and French, and then joined Bechtel in Gaithersburg, Maryland, where she worked on the design of nuclear power plants. After stints in Kansas, Barcelona, and San Francisco, she transferred to an assignment in Las Vegas. It was during a visit to her hometown that she learned the shocking news about her great-grandmother having been arrested for murder in 1913. What a thing to find out. She left her engineering career to find out what happened and write a book about it. Her original intention was to write one book about all four grandparents. As she began to pursue the story, she quickly discovered there was far too much for one book. Now there are three: East on the East Side, One Night in a Bad Inn, and Finding the Bad Inn, and Discovering My Family's Hidden Past. Her books are true stories, nonfiction, and a pleasure to read. Her first book was an award finalist. Please welcome Christy Leskovar.
Thank you, Deb, and thank you all for being here. It is a pleasure to be back at the Montana Historical Society. I have spent a lot of time in this building over the last few years. As Deb mentioned, my first book is One Night in a Bad Inn. This book, which I think some of you have already read. And as I was promoting my first book, One Night in a Bad Inn, I would be invited by all sorts of people, and I was invited to often speak to students. So I spoke to classrooms all the way from fourth grade to history class at Carroll and at Washington State University. And I did speak to the fourth graders. The teacher was a friend of my mother's in Pasco, Washington. And the First World War figures very largely in all three of my books, One Night in a Bad Inn, Finding the Bad Inn, and East of the East Side. And so I was talking about the First World War, and the little boy, Pedro, raised his hand, and he said, "Were you alive during that war?" And I said, "That war ended in 1918, and now it's 2008. And the teacher said, quick math. So they're all, calculating how many years that was. Okay, one of them got the right answer, 90. And so she said, "So Pedro, now that you know that war was 90 years ago, do you still think that Miss Leskovar was alive then?" I've been told I look pretty good for over 90, but so I'm happy to be back here in Helena, and I'm staying over at the Carolina B&B, which is at 6th and Ewing, and my publisher for this book, for East of the East Side, is here in Helena, far country. And we had done all the arrangements, as people do now, over the phone or internet or email and all that. And so I hadn't met the folks there, and I wanted to pick up some books because I spoke in Boulder last night. And so I needed to have books to sell in Boulder and in East Helena. I'm going to be in East Helena on Saturday. And so I wasn't sure exactly how to get there. I know somewhat of my way around Helena. So I put the navigation in. So I go down. The first thing it tells me is to turn onto Cruz Avenue. Well, Tommy Cruise's story is in East of the East Side. And then it tells me to turn onto Neal Avenue. John Neal's story is in east of the East Side. And then I get to Far Country, and it's right next to the Kessler Brewery. His story, Kessler's story, is in east of the East Side. So it's sort of like, didn't do it on purpose, but I'm like sort of touring my book with street names. So that was kind of fun. So we had a little bit of chat about Butte, because who doesn't want to talk about Butte? It's a wonderful place. It's my hometown, but we are here in Helena. And so I thought I would begin by reading a little bit of that, because Helena does play a large part, Helena and East Helena, east of the East Side. Now, in my family, all roads lead to Butte, so we do get to Butte. But I thought I'd read a little bit about Helena today. There they were, 4 men, wandering through the new Montana territory in search of gold. Not somebody else's gold, their own find, their own strike. They would be known as the 4 Georgians. The year was 1864. They had all but given up. They were exhausted and discouraged. Then they decided, we'll go out one more time, one more prospecting trip. It's our last chance. And they went, and they found gold. There it was, a fortune, lying about, waiting for them to pick it up. They called the place Last Chance Gulch. Mining was a hot opportunity in the 19th century. The industrial age needed metals for fodder, and who doesn't want gold? The possible payoffs were enormous. The Western territories, fast turning into states, were rich in precious metals, there for the taking if you could get to them, which wasn't easy. The Montana gold rush started when it was still part of the Idaho Territory. Before that, there was the California gold rush, the Colorado gold rush, silver at the Comstock in Nevada, and now gold in Montana. Many a young man caught the fever of speculation. It was a fever that could burn a man up. News of gold in Last Chance Gulch drew more miners, and a mining camp started to form. Miners get thirsty. They'd need a saloon. A saloon opened. Miners need supplies. A merchant opened a store. The miners wanted news from the outside world. A man started a newspaper. Those horses and mules would need to be shod. A blacksmith opened a shop. The mining camp was fast becoming a town. The miners voted and named it Helena. All who live in Helena today can drop down on their knees and thank Almighty God that the miners did not pick one of the other names bandied about for the town, which included Pumpkinville and Crabtown, after John Crab, one of the 4 Georgians. I'm going to take a wild guess that those who suggested such names were not sober. I find it remarkable how fast things happened back then. One day you have a broad, desolate mountain valley, prairie with nothing but pronghorn antelope and deer, and a gold-laden creek running through it. Nary a soul for miles except the occasional trapper and nomadic Indians wandering through. Only 2 years later, after those 4 men discovered gold, a town has sprung up, a hospital has opened, and Helena has not 1, but 3 newspapers. So how did these people on the cover of my book, how did they all end up in Helena and East Helena and then Butte? Well, the book begins with this man, Tony Leskovar, in Paris. He's actually from a little farm near a place called Pushka Gora, which is in present-day Slovenia, which at that time was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And he, at age 16, he was not going to stay on the family farm. He fell in love with music at a very young age, and he went off to the big city, Ljubljana, to study music. So he got a job in a co-op, paid for his lessons at the conservatory, and he loved the woodwinds. So he became a bassoonist. And he performed with the orchestra there in Ljubljana, the Philharmonic, and then with the Zurich Opera, and then he's at the Paris Opera. Now, he's 28 years old, he's a musician, he's performing with the opera in Paris, he has arrived. I mean, he is really at the top of his game professionally. But it's 1914, And what happens in June of 1914? The Austrian Archduke is shot, and a month later, pretty much all Europe goes to war. So Tony is essentially behind enemy lines. And so he, as far as I can tell, he passed himself off as being Serbian. The Serbs and the French were on the same side. Austria was on the other side in the war. And so he's in a pickle. Okay, I'm going to move on then to Caroline, who was Carolina Stengel. She was also from what is now Slovenia, then Austria-Hungary, a different area called Novo Mesto. She was from near Novo Mesto, and she is the offspring of the Baron and the maid. Now, in the 19th century in Austria, if the child was born out of wedlock and the father would not attest to paternity, legally that child had no father. But what happened in some cases, and I think happened in this case, was the father would furtively get some money to the support of the child. And her mother died when she was quite young, and so then Carolina is sent into service in Vienna as a kitchen maid. So any of you who watched Downton Abbey, Carolina was in a similar situation as the character of Daisy, except for, of course, Carolina is a real person. These are real people. But, you know, for a girl in her situation from a peasant community to go off to Vienna to work for a wealthy family, this was, probably a pretty good situation for her. And then she becomes a cook, and the Viennese cooks were very sought after, even more so than the Parisian cooks. It's amazing the things you discover when you start to do historical research. And so when she's around age 20, she comes into some money from a mysterious benefactor. And I found out about that by the archivist in Novo Mesto contacted me one day and said, I think, because I had gone over to Slovenia to do research, and he said, I found something I think might interest you. And they had a book, Children in Need of Care, and it showed about the money and the go-between, essentially, to get the money to Caroline. So what does she do with the money? She gets on a ship, and she comes to America by herself, doesn't speak a word of English, and she goes, of all the places she could go, New York, Cincinnati, Cleveland, Toronto, all these places that had Slovenian enclaves, she goes to what my Irish relatives would call back of beyond. She goes to Calumet, Michigan, which is way up there on the Upper Peninsula. And why does she go to Calumet? Well, because there were copper mines there, and there were a lot of Slovenians there. And she goes to work essentially as a hired girl for a woman who, it's funny, they end up being relatives of the loan shark in East Butte. Small world. Larko was his name. So while she's there, someone notices her. This Joe Lozar notices her. He is also from the old country, but another area called Bela Krajina. And where Joe was from, where Tony was from, even though these places geographically are not very far apart, some of the customs were very different. So where Tony was from, the farm would go to one of the children, and that, in this case, it was his sister and her husband, with the agreement that they would take care of the parents and take over the farm. But where Joe was from, they divided the farm. He had, I think it was 5 kids in the family, so these farms they were just too small. You could not support a family because of that custom. So Joe had come over here to the United States, and he kind of made his way across the country just selling, kind of like a peddler, just selling things out of his suitcase. And so Caroline decides she's not going to stay in Calumet because she hears about another job that sounds really good. And it's in this new town in a new state, and a smelter has just been built, and they need a cook. And so off she goes to East Helena, when East Helena was not even a white spot in the road. It was really just born, and Montana was just a new state. And so Joe follows her out here, and they get married at the cathedral here in Helena, and start a family. So Joe buys a saloon in East Helena, and then he buys half of the saloon, and then he buys the other half, and then he saves his money, and he builds what a lot of you know of as called the Old Rock Hut. So if you were driving from Helena to East Helena, going past East Helena really, that 2-story stone building that you would see from the highway, that was a saloon he built. I think it was 1899. And so he had really a good thing going. He had this saloon, and he sold Kessler's beer there. He helped put Kessler on the map, and he had a mercantile, and they had a boarding house, and everything's great until Joe gets gold fever, and he starts prospecting like crazy. I could not believe how many mines I found. I think I was at the Lewis and Clark County Courthouse more hours a day than some of the employees were. I really just going through all those books and finding mine after mine that he claimed. And then there were some in Jefferson County, and then in Granite County, which is, pretty far. And so it's hard to know how many of these mines he was working at the same time, but there was one he was working that was kind of from East Helena, kind of going towards Canyon Ferry, kind of up in that area. And he finds out that somebody else has, they would call it, like you would have a mining claim, and then you would, what they call take it to patent, which means then you had the deed on the land, and then it also meant you had to start paying county property taxes on it. Well, he finds out that somebody has put a patent on a mine next to him, and it actually jumps his claim. So he files a lawsuit. That was his only remedy, was to file a lawsuit. So I looked that up at the courthouse, and I find the other people on the other side are John and Henry Neal. So I thought, a couple of Irish prospectors, scrappy immigrants like Joe, and they got into a tussle over this. And so then I'm upstairs here reading something else at the Montana Historical Society, and I just stumbled on all this vitriol being hurled at this man named John Neal. Like, is this the same John Neal, and what's the deal here? Well, it was the same John Neal. And what the story was is this was not an Irish immigrant. This was not a scrappy prospector. John Neal was one of the most powerful men in the state of Montana. He was a crony of William Andrews Clark. He's one of the people who convinced Clark to run for the Senate. He ran the newspaper, the Independent Record, and he was one of the bagmen for Clark in the election bribery scheme. And how I found out all that was the other bagman was Clark's lawyer, John Wellcome. And I think probably some of you are familiar with this. William Andrews Clark was one of the Copper Kings in Butte, and he wanted to be a United States senator. And at that time, the U.S. senators were elected by the state legislature. This was before the 17th or the 12th Amendment? I can't remember, to the Constitution for direct election of senators. And part of the reason why that happened is because of what happened in Montana. Yeah, there was during that election bribery scandal, there was, I think it was in St. Paul, there was a political cartoon that showed the $1,000 bill as the bill most often introduced to the Montana state legislature. Now, isn't that mind-boggling? $1,000 bill. Do they even print $1,000 bills? I mean, it's quite mind-boggling. So what happened was, when it all came out, the Montana State Bar started disbarment proceedings against John Wellcome. And that is like a legal proceeding. And so there is testimony, and there's a transcript. Everything's taken down by a court reporter. Well, that transcript is at the law library right here. And so I found that. I read the whole thing. It's hilarious in a way. It's tragic, at the time, but when you look back on it, it's hard not to see some of the humor in it. But they kept records. So they found a room, John Neal and John Wellcome, where there was a back door, like they rented a room. It was a hotel, I can't remember, or apartment building, whatever. Someplace where people didn't have to go through a lobby. They could come in through a back door. And they had one rate for Republicans and one rate for Democrats. And they gave them a down payment. So that's sort of like, okay, we'll give you this much now, and then once you vote the way we want you to, we'll give you the rest of it. So they kept records. So it was really pretty easy to prove. And then some of these guys who were, I can't remember if they were bribed or they tried to bribe them, testified. And so John Welcome was disbarred, and John Neal ends up buying the mansion across from John Hauser's mansion over there on 725 Madison Avenue. You know those houses. So he came out pretty well in all this, thanks to his friend, I'm sure, William Andrews Clark. So this is the man my great-grandfather decided to sue. And you can imagine how well this turned out. But I will leave that for the book. So, oh, poor Joe. He was, I think I refer to it as, he's Captain Ahab to John Neal, Moby Dick. So some people wonder or refer to my books as novels. They actually aren't novels, but they read like novels. They're actually all true. They're all factual. There's a very long bibliography and notes at the end of the book. And it's a pretty good-sized book, as you can see. So why is that? Why is it, if I was just writing about my family, I could write an essay, really, a short story. But when I set out to write these books, I wanted you to get to know the people in the books. And we know people in the context of time and place. So to know a person, you have to know where do they come from in two respects. Physically, where they come from, and as a family, who are their parents, where did they come from, what are the circumstances that made them the people they are. And also, I read a biography of Winston Churchill many years ago, and by William Manchester. Winston Churchill, did I say Winston Churchill. And at the beginning of the book, he described what life was like in London at the time, the author did. And I thought, I just love that. And so I really wanted to do that for Paris and Vienna, and then also, of course, Butte, Helena, East Butte. And so I did an enormous amount of historical and cultural research. When I say cultural research, the customs and that sort of thing. Some of them I knew from growing up, but in the old country, I didn't know all that. I also went to every place anything significant happened in the book, and we still have relatives in Slovenia, and the farm is still in our family. And the first time I went to Slovenia, the old house was still there, the thatched roof house, the old farmhouse that had been there for we don't know how long, stucco, thatched roof, and the family who lives there now, our relatives who live there now, live in a modern house. So what you get actually with the three books, One Night in a Bad Inn, Finding the Bad Inn, and East of the East Side, you really do get the sweep of Montana history between all three. With One Night in a Bad Inn begins with the homesteaders and then the miners in Butte, but it's the corporate mining. And in this, you get the experience, East of the East Side, you get the experience of the prospector. And we know way more prospectors that we didn't hear about than we did. And a professor at Washington State University said my books are like getting medicine in your peanut butter. You enjoy it, you get something good for you, but you really don't realize that. So I'm going to close here so that we have some time for questions. But what I do want to say is I think some people might have already read One Night in a Bad Inn, and anybody who did and who thought that possibly I idealized my grandmother in that book because she was my grandmother, well, they will be disabused of that notion when they read East of the East Side, because this grandma is a real spitfire. And my two grandmothers could not be more different. My Grandma T in One Night in a Bad Inn, who came from a horrible situation and really rose above it. That was really the point. Actually, both books really illustrate that we are not prisoners of our circumstances. We choose how to live. My grandmother was the child of two convicts, and she decided she was not going to live like that, and she was going to live a good life. And we have some similar themes here, really, that have to do with my father. And I think, so why write a warts and all story? Why not just write the nice things? Well, because I don't think you can appreciate a person's personal heroism if you just hear the nice things. And I think that's important. And also, why be it warts and all? It's because it's the truth. It's what really happened. Real life is kind of messy. So in closing, I like to quote Aunt Betsy, who said to her nephew, David Copperfield, It is in vain to recall the past unless it works some influence on the present. And my hope with my 3 books is that I have worked some positive influence on the present. So thank you for listening, and I would be happy to answer questions.
Am I on now? Yeah, okay.
So what did your grandfather, who played the bassoon, do when he came to Montana?
Okay, thank you for asking that question. So what he was doing when he came to Montana, this was the era of silent movies, and they were only silent in terms of talking, but there was music in the background in silent movies, and an orchestra traveled with the movie. The movie traveled from town to town, the film in these big cans on the train, and the orchestra traveled with it. And Tony did that, and the movie company went broke in Helena. So here he is in Helena, and then he heard that there was that they needed a band leader for the Smelter band in East Helena and music teacher. And so off he went there, and this lady on the cover of the book, Annie, she hears that this Austrian musician is coming to East Helena, and I think she probably imagined him to be tall and debonair and handsome, and he was. And her sister told me as soon as Annie saw Tony, she set her cap for him. And so that is how my grandparents were in East Helena. They met in East Helena.
Any other questions?
Right there.
Yes. I'm going to show my total ignorance here. It seems like you have to get old before you start caring about some of these things that are, now my grandfather's gone and so forth. But my grandparents were Slovenian, both immigrated. And my grandfather worked in the smelter for 40 years. I worked there in the summers in college and such. So, but first of all, what year did the World War I start? That's how ignorant I am. But what year was that?
1914. The war started in 1914. We went into it in 1917.
In 1917. Okay.
April of 1917. Yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Well, my grandfather was in the World War I on the side of the United States. So I guess what we're saying is he was fighting against his own regime that he came from. Is that
That's
so?
right. That's right.
We thought
That's
of it as Yugoslavia in the years that they came over. There was Yugoslavia then, and we visited a couple of times. But anyway, so I guess that just blows my mind to think that he was actually fighting against, in a sense, his heritage.
Yeah. Was he in Montana when he went into the war?
Yes.
He was.
Yeah.
Okay. So he was then most likely he was in the 91st Division, the Wild West Division, and their story is in One Night in a Bad Inn.
Okay. There's
Yeah.
actually a picture, I think, at the Military Museum out there.
Fort
where
Harrison.
He's in there. Yeah.
Do you know what regiment? Was it the?
Don't.
Okay.
I
yeah.
don't. We found his hat, but that's when like I say, I never started paying attention until recently, and I regret that.
Well, just a little, since you mentioned Yugoslavia, before World War I, it was the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which was enormous and included, what is today Slovenia, Croatia, Czech Republic, Slovakia, part of Poland, huge. So after the war, Treaty of Versailles broke up the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and what one country that was formed was the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes. And then that became called the Kingdom of Yugoslavia.
What
And
year
then-
was that about?
1918 is when the war ended. So the Treaty of Versailles was in 1919.
Okay.
And so that's when this new country was born, and then it changed names a few times, and then after World War II became communist. Yeah, I did go. I went when it was communist, and I went when it was free Slovenia. I cannot. The difference is so remarkable. When we were there when it was communist to visit our relatives, everybody felt like they were afraid. You got that sense that people were afraid to talk to you. And when we went when it was Slovenia and was free, oh, everybody wanted to talk to you. Everybody's happy, you know. It was just alive. The place was alive now. It was remarkable. A lady right there.
Thank you for sharing, but I'm really intrigued on the research on how you were able to find all of that about your ancestors. And could you give us, well, a Reader's Digest on where you started and what your adventures were doing that?
Well, the first thing I did, which of course a lot of us are limited now in this, is I talked to every relative I could. And I was fortunate of who was still around. Also, I was very lucky. When I was in high school, my American literature teacher had us write our family history. And I wrote to I only had great aunts at that point. I didn't have any great uncles. But anyway, I wrote to them. My grandmother on my mom's side was still alive. And they wrote letters. And so the one letter from Aunt Stephanie is an amazing oral history, really, of East Helena, of what life was like. It was funny. So I was here. One other thing I did do is other people's oral histories. I combed the Historical Society here for those, and then I realized I have the best oral history, really, of East Helena, which was that letter from my Aunt Stephanie. And so that was one thing. And then what I do when I'm doing the research, what it really helps me, is that I make a timeline. And so I have the date, and I have events in family history, and then events in world and local history. So as I was doing, talking to family members, just even collecting birth records, death certificates, that sort of thing, I would put them there, and other events, like when they bought the business in Butte, or when he built the saloon in East Helena. And then when I put what was happening in local and national and world history, that helped make things make sense. And that also helped me kind of give me more direction on where to look. So I guess my advice is you just start with what you have. If you have the stories, you write them down, and then you start thinking, well, where can I get a little more background on this? This is a great place, Historical Society here.
Yeah, you can't find everything on Google.
No, you can't.
We'll just...
No, you can't. And also, I can't think of an example right. Well, I'll give you, nothing's popping in my head right now, but there's so many times when I was here at the Montana Historical Society, or I was at the Butte Archives, or when I also went back to, for one night in a bad inn, I went back to the War College, the Military History Institute. And I'll give you, there's an example there. So I'm just talking to the librarian. Now, things just pop up when you're just talking to people, and it doesn't really happen when you're emailing or calling. So I'm talking to the librarian there at the Military History Institute, and I told him what I was doing, and I had already, it was kind of interesting with that. You tell them what regiment, which division, which regiment, and they just bring out a box. And it's like a shoebox, but it's not a shoebox, but that idea where you just put stuff in there. And there were field messages and field orders and reports about what happened in the war, and this was a big jigsaw puzzle. So I'm talking to him, and I told him my grandfather was in 362nd Regiment, and I couldn't find a regimental history. And he said, oh, John Kontrovich has it. I said, well, who is he? Like I should know who he is. And he said, well, he lives in Springfield, Massachusetts. So I think I called him. This was, really this was pre-Google, actually. So I called him, and he had it. And he said, I'll make a copy, and, just for the cost of the copying and the postage, he sent it to me. Well, I also did a lot of research at the National Archives. None of these archives have that regimental history. As far as I know, I have it, and John Kontrovich has it, if he's still with us. So, yeah, you can't find everything on Google. But one thing I tell you I did find on Google, which was kind of amazing. So Again, I mentioned that book that by William Manchester about Churchill, about describing what life was like in London, and I wanted to describe what was life like for Tony when the war started. So here he's in Paris, World War I starts. What was happening? So I called Mitch, Mitch Yockelson. He was the World War I specialist at the National Archives when I researched One Night in a Bad Inn, and he said, well, you might want to get the diplomatic cables. Okay, never thought of that. So I thought, well, going back to DC is a big trip. I live in Las Vegas, and I thought, well, I kind of put that on my to-do list in case something else came up, that I needed to go to the National Archives for. Then I thought, I'm gonna Google it. And so I did. And so I think I'd Googled Paris, American ambassador, 1914, or World War I can't remember, and up popped this book. One copy in the world is in London, and I bought it. And it was a book where he told everything that was happening when the war started. It was fascinating. Like, one thing was nobody could get money. Everything was frozen. So for Tony, if he had any money in the bank, he could not get it. All you had was what was in your pocket. And I read Edith Wharton's account, the author of, I'm blanking on her books right now. Famous author, Edith Wharton, very wealthy American woman. She and all these Americans who are in Paris, they're trying to pay their hotel bills, get on a steamship, and leave Europe because everybody's going to war. They could not get any money. She cabled her banker in New York. He said, nothing I can do. They said, the French said, we're in a state of war. No money can leave the country. And President Wilson ended up literally sending a ship full of gold to Europe to help settle accounts for stranded Americans so they could get home. So, well, I could talk for a very, very long time about this, obviously, but I think I'll close. And I'm going to go ahead and head out to the gift shop where they have the books for sale, and I'll sign books, and I'd be happy to discuss anything else while we're out there.
You can talk to Christy out there, but we'll get everybody out there, and I'm sure you have more questions. But thank you for being here, and Christy, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.